Good afternoon. I'm David Clark, Technical Director at the Railway Industry Association, or RIA for short, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this, the third day of our week of webinars focusing on the Digital Railway Programme, which is arguably the most significant engineering programme in the industry over the next 20 years, certainly one of the most challenging. I need to emphasise here that RIA is not the sole contributor to these events. They're organised in conjunction with Network Rail and the UK Rail Research and Innovation Network, or UCRIN, and supported by Network Rail. Had this been a physical event, we would have been hosted for the third time by UCRIN member, the University of Birmingham. So thank you to them for their continued support. And of course, I want to thank all our speakers, without whom none of this would be possible. So let's quickly look at what we're covering during this week of webinars. On Monday, we heard an overview of the project from Network Rail and from LNER. Yesterday, we looked at the first rollout projects, particularly East Coast and Cap Fitment. And today, we'll look ahead, discussing what we need to do in the next few years to develop the skills and tools that we'll need as we roll out the digital railway. Tomorrow, we'll focus on some of the innovations already happening and the R&D, which will drive future innovation, which promises to be a really exciting day. On Friday, the discussion is about supply chain building and the opportunities for SMEs in the programme. And as this is an unlocking innovation event, and innovation is going to be vital to delivering the programme, each day we'll also be hearing from people who are already innovating and people who are supporting innovation. So just to remind everyone that you can ask questions by text using the questions dialog box in the grey control panel. We'll have a panel Q&A for the last 15 minutes or so of our time today when we'll deal with those questions. If there's any of them that we're not able to deal with today, then we'll deal with them afterwards and send that out by email. So today we'll be looking a little way into the future to explore how the industry is going to tackle the perfect storm, which Martin Jones is going to describe in a few minutes' time. The question we're asking today is, what do we need to do differently in a digital railway to be part of the solution to this situation we find ourselves in? You'll have hopefully heard of the rail sector deal, but just in case you haven't, this deal was signed in 2018, and it's an agreement between government, Network Rail, and the supply chain. Next slide. And this is what it says. When you boil it down, it's really, really quite simple. There's an ask of industry, or an ask by industry, that DfT, Network Rail, and HS2 provide a 5-year plan and longer-term roadmap, and that's addressed by the long-term deployment plan, which you're going to hear from Pat McFadden about. And in exchange for that, the industry offers that by the end of 2025, we'll have brought whole industry costs down to European benchmark levels. And it's important to emphasize whole industry, that's client and supplier. And that's addressed by the sector deal delivery strategy and target 190, which you're going to hear from Martin Jones and from Rob Morris, the industry champion. So I'm going to hand over now to Martin Jones, who is the Control Command and Signalling Engineer at Network Rail. So Martin, over to you.
Okay, thank you, David. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Excellent. So what I wanted to do this afternoon is really introduce everyone to the wider industry challenge we face. Clearly, as an industry, we all want to move towards an ETCS railway. We want to realise the benefits of that in terms of performance and safety for our passengers. But for Network Rail, there's a real burning platform as well, and that's around the sustainability challenge we face for our conventional signalling, which is becoming increasingly difficult to sustain because of renewals costs and the access that's required to support that. And add on top of that the fact that we have a bow wave of renewals through CP7, CP8 and CP9. So Pat McFadden is going to be talking shortly after me in a moment about the ETCS long-term deployment plan, which is a realistic renewals-led approach to ETCS deployment. This will help unlock some of the challenges around the volume of work that's required. However, it identifies further challenges for us as an industry, particularly in the area of unit costs for the work and the fact that there's still challenges around the access that would be required. We're also going to hear about how Network Rail are addressing this through a research and development program known as Target 190, and how through collaboration with the sector deal, we're looking to tackle the challenges that have been identified by the long-term deployment plan. So now I'd like to hand over to Pat, who's going to go into a lot more detail on the long-term deployment plan.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I was tasked with creating a long-term deployment plan, which the question came from Chris Grayling, the then Secretary of State for Transport, asking for a plan from Network Rail about how it was going to transfer its whole network in the long term to digital technologies. In order to do that, or to tackle that ask, we first had to make sure we fully understood the driver behind it, because that's a bit solutionist in its statement. We needed to understand the problem first. So if I can move on. Yeah, there we are. And the problem is that for the last 10 years at least, we've been living in a world of an undeliverable and unaffordable renewable demand. And we've not been meeting that demand because we can't afford it and we can't get the access. And we couldn't tackle the logistics of renewing at that rate anyway in conventional signalling. So the net result has been a ever decaying remaining life of the asset, and effectively we're on a long, slow journey to an irrecoverable situation. So that's why Chris Grayling was saying we need to make a migration, but we need to understand the science behind that. And I would also like to point out that this, in terms of a migration to a digital solution, it's not as an overlay, retaining conventional, renewing conventional, keeping conventional working, because that would not be cheaper than retaining and renewing the conventional. So we have to migrate from conventional to ETCS. And of course, that then means that your program becomes front-end loaded with train fitment, because you have to fit all the trains before you can start operating an exclusively ETCS railway. So if I can move this on, this is the analysis of the infrastructure model in terms of if we renew at exactly the right time for the lowest whole life cost of the asset, what does it look like? I'll take you to the top left histogram first. For the next couple of slides, you've got volume on the left and cost on the right. And you'll see, pretty much ignore the color coding on that, but the red line is the maximum renewable rate that we believe we can achieve in conventional signalling. And that's derived from conversations and workshops with suppliers and within Network Rail and with the train operating companies. And it's largely constrained by access to the railway and the sheer logistics of delivering big volumes in conventional with all the civil engineering associated, etc. The big spike you can see in the middle of CP7 is a planning spike. It's not real, and I could have just spread that across the remaining time available, but actually where it's come from is that's a residual that we should have renewed in CP6 to keep our heads above water. So it gives everybody a feel for the size of the problem and how fast it is growing. So I've left it there so you can get that perception from it. On the right, you'll see there's a red line on that graph as well. That's the cost graph. And that's £830 million per annum run rate. And that was the figure we reached in agreement with the DFT and network planning in terms of our available funding to buy our way out of this signalling renewal problem. If we can find a solution within that budget, then that budget can be made available. So that's our cost ceiling, if you like, and the volume ceiling. You can see that the conventional renewed at the optimum moment doesn't fix either of those problems. So I've moved us on to a similar but different slide now. This is what we've been doing for the last 10 years, actually. This is life extending to get ourselves out of renewals and living with the volumes we can afford. So we've still got the two red lines at the same place. But now on the constrained volumes histogram, if you look, there's a new dark blue overlay above the line. That is the cost and the resource demand for life extensions alone. And you can see that that consumes a very big percentage of our budget and our capability before you even start thinking about signal renewals plans. So that's our current untenable situation. And it's really a sad tale to say that we've been heading towards that, and it's been getting worse for 10 years, but that is the case. And unless we change and innovate, that will remain our only option. And ultimately, that will lead to us having to take some very tough decisions about clipping up assets and reducing our capability on the network because we can't afford it anymore, or we can't get the access to sustain it. So that's a fairly bleak slide that shows why we have to go to an alternative solution. So about the only show in town on alternative solutions is ETCS at the moment. And we can only use ETCS volume and cost as we understand it at the moment. So what does that look like? So this is the unconstrained version. This is if we optimize at the exact right moment for whole life cost. And we've got a new ceiling now for volumes of 3,000 SEUs per annum. That comes from the fact that there's far less intrusion needed to trackside to build an ETCS railway than there is to build a conventionally signalled railway. And also, you can do far more of your work in a lab before you go anywhere near site. So this is where you start to get to digital twins and powerful simulation models to enable us to design and validate design before we go anywhere near a site, so that by the time you're testing on site, all you're really testing is whether you built what you said you were going to build and whether it's to adequate quality. Sorry, we've done a mistake. Whether it's adequate quality, and everything else can be done off-site. On the right is the resultant cost histogram, and the budget line is the same. I'd like to draw your attention to the dark orange, light orange relationship. The dark orange is the cost of train fitment plus the cost of business train change for the train operating companies, both freight and passenger, not freight fitment. Freight fitment is funded separately, but the expectation is that from CP7 onwards, we will need to fund the train fitment out of the signal renewals budget. And the reason for that is that we are the agent of change in introducing ETCS. The thing I want to draw your attention to is that although it's painful and difficult and it's all front-end loaded on train fitment, in absolute cost terms, it's not a big percentage. And it doesn't actually make much sense to reshape your plan to minimize train fitment or wait for trains to become life expired or any of that sort of stuff, because your costs of infrastructure are so much bigger, and so as soon as you move away from the optimum position for infrastructure, the costs go through the roof. So that told us immediately that we were right to be pushing for train fitment to enable infrastructure, not wait for train fitment and then go and do infrastructure, which had been in other scenarios part of the thinking. And so I think yesterday came through a question about, well, is fitment of new trains mandatory? And at the start of the preparing of this long-term plan, it most definitely wasn't. And it's moving towards that now as a result of these findings. So if we try and smooth that in the same way that we have done so far for conventional, it looks like this. Now what we're seeing here, and I do want to use the colours on this, light purple is the ETCS works, and the other colours are the conventional type works that we're used to today, and trackside. In this scenario, we discussed quite at length with suppliers and with our own internal capabilities the type of resources that could be available.
Pat, this is Milda here from RIA. We appear to have some interference with your sound. Can you please, can you try again?
Yeah.
Oh, that's so much better. Thank you.
Is it okay? I've just moved a bit nearer. I just need to reposition my glasses now to be able to see it. Sorry about that, folks. Yes, I was saying that the workforce is split here ETCS works in the light purple will be done by a largely new type of skills, whether that's existing signal engineers and existing supplier skills reshaped or not remains to be seen, but it's a new type of skill demand compared to the life extension work and the trackside works. And so although we break the 3,000 SEUs per annum budget in total, we believe we can cope with the trackside renewals and the conventional type renewals that peak out above the red line, so long as we can keep the ETCS works to around that 3,000 SEU threshold. Now, that threshold is a bit arbitrary. It's made up from basic logic saying that this is a renewals-led plan. There's no enhancements in here. It's driven by asset condition, and asset condition expiry tends to happen in a fairly random way across the country. So we can have geographically dispersed teams, something of the order of 10, and each scheme that they would be doing at any one time would be something of the order of 300 SEUs. And the life of a scheme would be about a year in development, a year in delivery, and a year in closeout. And they could have 3 on the go at once, 1 in each of those. So you end up with 300 SEUs per year run rate by a team times 10 teams gives you 3,000 SEUs. But it's really 10 schemes. And if those schemes were instead 400 SEUs, then if that were affordable, that would probably be deliverable. The problem is the more we try to do quickly and the harder we try to run in volumes in ETCS, the less affordable it remains, because if you look to the right, we haven't got under the financial threshold by any stretch at all. We are still way over budget, and that's at a predicted rate for ETCS of about 2/3 of the conventional. Now the thing is, with conventional signalling, we know how much it costs. We've worked for years to drive that cost down. We believe we're as lean as we're going to get in that area. In ETCS, we don't really know. We're not experienced. We've got first schemes happening now. The suppliers, I think, quite accurately have said that they'll get to their best rates probably on their 3rd scheme, not their 1st. So, but we don't know what that will be yet. Therefore, we are well over budget. So the run rate is constrained by cost here, not by our volume delivery, whereas in conventional, it's the other way around. We couldn't deliver no matter what it costs. We just couldn't get through that sort of volume. So let's put those together, those numbers together. And in the top left now, you're looking at the cost profile comparison of conventional, constrained and unconstrained, and ETCS constrained. And you can see that there's not a huge cost-benefit difference there. The ETCS is certainly no more expensive than conventional, but it doesn't solve our cost problem. However, it does solve our capacity problem, or has the potential to solve our capacity problem. So the next thing we needed to ask ourselves was, what should it be, or what can it possibly cost if we have to do those volumes? Because the question now turns on its head. Instead of up till now, we've worked on it very much on the principle of, we know what signaling we want, we know what safe looks like, we know what effective looks like, how much does it cost? In the new world, we actually have to step back from that and say, we know how much it has to cost to be able to sustain this network. What can we have for that money? And we did some benchmarking in Europe, as was mentioned, I think, earlier by Martin. And we found a unit rate in Europe that's about equivalent to 190k per SEU. Now, SEUs don't really work. They're signaling equivalent units, and they work for conventional. You can count signals, you can count points. It doesn't really work in ETCS, but we had to keep comparing apples with apples. So we've counted the SEUs in the conventional we're replacing, and then extrapolated onto that the cost of the ETCS that would replace it. So that gives us a run rate, a target run rate of about 190k per SEU, which is where we need to get to make this work. So what's the fleet fitment ask look like? And you heard yesterday from Siemens about the freight fitment. So this is largely passenger, and the volumes on the left are passenger. Similar to freight, first in class is a big ask. That's the design effectively of a retrofit. And you can see that we have 19 of those. There are 20 freight classes, so split 50-50 or thereabouts. We already have 7% of the network of the fleet of trains fitted and requiring little or no action. We have another 12% requiring a baseline upgrade, and we have combined either ready to fit or retrofit with no preparation ready to fit. Now, ready to fit varies from fleet to fleet, but that comes to something of the order of 40% is 21 and 27, and 33% or so of trains will become life expired before we get there with ETCS, on the assumption of a 35-year service life of a train. That gives the run rate you can see on the right there, which is totally front-end loaded, as I said earlier, but is necessary to enable this plan. So the big ask is, how do we do this fleet fitment in CP6 when we have no budget within renewals to deflect towards it? The freight fitment is provided for. If I move on a slide, I'll get that breakdown a bit more. The graph is a cumulative version of what you were just looking at. The funding situation for train fitment in CP6 is as on the table below, which is quite interesting, really. The funding provided so far to date, and we know where it's coming from, the DfT have got that money for us and it's ongoing and in contract, comes to about £300 million. On top of that, there's a known deficit to support projects which the DfT have authorised, which is East Coast Main Line and Trans-Pennine Route Upgrade, which demands a further 280 million, which is no surprise to government or the DfT, and they have that, they assure us in the pipeline, although that's not actually authorised yet. But this plan advises them of a new ask for train fitment to enable long-term deployment of 374 million in CP6, which gives a grand total of £654 million worth of costs still to be met in CP6. And that is the challenge that the DfT and the Treasury are faced with to support this plan. So, in terms of getting started, getting match fit is the term that the suppliers like to use, and I like it too. It refers to the fact, as I mentioned earlier, that you're not going to hit all your targets on your very first attempt. You need to practice this. We need to get enough of the supply market up to speed and going to be able to do this, and that all needs to happen in CP6 and the early part of CP7. So the DfT have responded about as positively as they could have to the long-term plan and said, okay, so let's take the first tranche off the pile, which are those schemes that require action in CP6 to enable delivery in CP7. Second tranche is the schemes that require either get delivered in their entirety in CP7 or must start in CP7 to keep the run rate going into CP8. And the numbers for those are of the order of 9 schemes or so sitting in CP6 and 7, and another 22 sitting in CP7 or CP7 or CP8. So DfT took the 9 that are sitting in CP6 and asked us to break them down into tranches of 3s. And the idea is that we go to Treasury approaching them for train fitment for the first 3, show real commitment through East Coast Main Line and the development of those 3 schemes, and then go back for the next 3, and then lastly the last 3 to make up the 9. So this heat map gives an idea of our choices about how we're going to go about this. And you can see St Albans, Bedford, Ely, Peterborough and Warrington, which has become Warrington and Wigan combined, are the 3 that sit front of the queue. And if I move on again, okay, I'll stay on this one. Those 3, there's no mistake and no accident that they pick off the main spines of the railway up the centre of England. So they pick up the West Coast Main Line, Midland Main Line, and East Coast Main Line grows over into Anglia. And that drives train fitment as we need it as a diverse challenge over the whole of CP6 to get going to really deliver CP7 volumes. So anyone wondering what's happened to Scotland and Wales? Well, Scotland comes a bit later in the programme and is completely separate area anyway, because they're separately governed, so the DfT don't have absolute say there. And Wales just happens that a large part of Wales is either very new conventional signalling or mechanical, and so comes at the back of the queue. Mechanical comes at the back of the queue because it's the safest and easiest to life extend. And so when you put the safety factor into a deferred plan, the mechanical comes to the back of the queue. But when we do arrive in Wales, which is 2035, we then come through like a burning fire, delivering ETCS through Wales. So what do our forecast volumes look like? And I said 3,000 SEUs per year is our ceiling, and it looks like this. And this is the getting fit, getting match fit. The first couple of years of CP7 is largely tail end of East Coast Main Line. And then those schemes I've just been talking to you about come on stream, big time delivery. And by CP8, we are achieving the 15,000 SEUs per control period, or 3,000 per year, that we set out to achieve. And the 4,000 spikes are because we have schemes that probably will be more like 400 SEUs than 300. So on that note, I'd just like to conclude with a little bit of a strapline, really. That it looks to me like when carrying on as we are is untenable, which we believe it is, subscribing to change looks remarkably good value. And innovation is no longer optional. In fact, it's our only option. So on that note, I'll hand over to Martin.
Okay, thank you, Pat. Okay.
Hi, Martin, this is Milda again here. You are currently upside down. Maybe you can adjust your iPad.
Oh, what's happened there?
Okay, you are still upside down.
That's fine as far as I can see.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay, fantastic. Carry on.
Okay, thanks for that, Milda. Okay, so thank you to Pat there, who I think has really led in nicely to my presentation, which is, you can see his target, the first page here is around why target 190 plus. Well, hopefully you got a bit of a clue from Pat there that the long-term deployment plan has really highlighted the unit rate we need to get down to make the future ETCS-based railway affordable. And clearly, I've already mentioned the fact we need to move to an ETCS railway because our conventional signalling-based railway is completely unaffordable. And let's just be really clear here, even if we had unlimited money, the amount of disruptive access that is required means that we wouldn't be able to do it effectively, and we wouldn't be best serving our passengers. And you can see some of the scenes there from Finsbury Park a few years back when things go wrong. So we've got to move away from disruptive access. We know we've got to drive down cost. We know we have a signalling renewals bow wave coming. And we know that working conventionally, as we do with our current processes, relies on humans doing the right thing all of the time. So the Waterloo collision in 2017 highlights what happens when that goes wrong. So we need to move into a more automated space. So long-term deployment plan has shown that a move to ETCS can make the volume challenge more achievable, but we've still got more work to do. And that's really in the areas of driving down cost and reducing the access requirements. So this is where the Target 190 Plus program comes in. And firstly, we've been really explicit here. We've named the whole program around what we're trying to achieve, which is a unit rate of 190k for the ETCS infrastructure side. So that's a significant reduction on what we believe costs are today. And like I say, it doesn't stop there. We want to change how we do delivery to achieve that, and fundamentally to look at reducing the amount of access that's required. Key areas of opportunity for us, we think, are around how we approach assessing our assets as they are and using the BIM approach for that. So we have a standardized baseline. That then allows a automated design approach to be adopted, and beyond that, automated testing and assurance. And I'll talk a bit more about that further on in this pack. We want to get to a standardized system architecture so that we're not tied to bespoke systems, and that will allow more suppliers to get involved in the supply of equipment. And the big thing that we really want to do is to change our approach to planning renewals in the signalling space. Currently today in the conventional signalling space, we clearly, when we're putting new signals up, we've got to think 30 years ahead. We've got to be thinking what sort of service do we need to be able to support, because once that big signalling gantry is put up, it's going to be there for some time. So we want to move to a space that when we move to ETCS, we don't need to think like that, because we'll do a like-for-like renewal, replacing what we had with an ETCS equivalent. And with our new processes, making changes will be much simpler to do. So we'll be able to be agile and respond to our customers' needs. If freight need a new connection, we can put it in much more quickly, so in under 6 months, without all of the difficulties we have with today's processes. So really moving to a digital platform should allow the industry to become far more responsive to our customers' needs. Now, Target 190 Plus is not operating in isolation. There are clearly other industry development programs in flight. So European research initiatives such as Shift to Rail. There's the sector deal, which David covered briefly at the outset. Ukraine, many other players operating in this space. Now, for us in Target 190, which I should say is funded within Network Rail, within our CP6 settlement, as agreed with the ORR, to target our sustainability challenge, we have obviously identified that the sector deal are also targeting the similar thing. So we are now realizing that by working together, we can both achieve our common goals more quickly and more effectively. So for Network Rail, we get the benefit of access to expert resource from industry, and for the industry, I think more widely, they get access to some of the funding we've got for CP6 RD&T, and the overall benefit will be quicker benefits for the whole industry. So we want to get to much faster implementation of some of the schemes we're developing. So in terms of how we work alongside the sector deal, if we think of Target 190 Plus, it's for this program is running through the whole of CP6, and some of the stuff that Target 190 Plus is looking at is very long term. So when I talk about the reference architecture for signalling, the future architecture, we may not see any of that hitting the infrastructure for at least 10 years, maybe 15 years, but there are other elements within Target 190 Plus which we had hoped to see hitting the ground within CP7, if not before. And it's for those early pieces where we really want to work with a sector deal to accelerate delivery. And there are 3 key areas that we've identified which we think we can work with a sector deal on. And the way we're trying to normalize that, if you like, is by creating cross program remits, which we refer to as transverse remits, which describe how we in Network Rail of our RD&T program in T190 will work with a sector deal to deliver these 3 key areas. So a little more on those 3 key areas. So firstly, we have the GRIP 1 to 4 tool set. So this is looking at creating a digital tool set which allow us to accelerate and streamline the scheme development process. So think GRIP 1 to 4 in today's money. So we want to make that much quicker using some of the tools we're developing. That then leads into the GRIP 5 to 7 synthetic environment project. And I know that tomorrow Clive Roberts and Andrew Hunter are going to be doing a slot on that, as I understand it. So I won't go into too much detail now, but that really is looking at how we reduce on-site testing and do our assurance in a lab environment. And that will really help us in terms of reducing disruptive access when we come to scheme delivery. And it gives us a lot more confidence about how things will actually work in the real world. And then last area here is a really important one, which is obviously how we work with the supply chain. How do we set up our commercial models so that the suppliers can do what they do best, and that we don't drive cost into the delivery of our schemes. And I know when we come to Q&A, that's something I think Sue will be better placed to answer than me, but there's some real opportunity there. So if we think of the big picture then, we have the long-term deployment plan for ETCS, which sets out what we need to achieve as the industry. It tells us that what we want to do isn't affordable. So we've got then the Target 190 Plus R&D program to look at how we drive cost out of our current processes for ETCS. We then use the sector deal to accelerate applying those new processes and tools in the real world. If you think of that as a transition and transformation phase or part of that. And by demonstrating that we can really do this, so by demonstrating a synthetic environment, showing it really works, we can then start to plan for that as business as usual in the deployment and delivery phase. And that's where that starts to feed back into our long-term deployment plan. So as we see the benefits, we realise that we can make them real, we'll then revisit the long-term deployment plan to show those benefits. So reduce costs, potentially quicker deployment as well. So we can, all of this is intertwined, and I think that's the key message really, is that as an industry, the long-term deployment plan is where we are today, but it's a live plan, and we will adjust it as we see the benefits from our research and development program. Now, clearly, all of this can't happen in isolation. The whole industry has to come along with us because there's a huge amount of people change and company change required to support this. But I think we've made a good start by showing how as an industry we can work together, both between Target 190 and Sector Deal. So I'm now going to hand back to David, who I think is then going to hand over to the Sector Deal champions.
Thank you very much, Martin and Pat. You've covered an awful lot of ground there. For delegates, to make you aware, if you've not spotted it already, you can download the slides from the handout section in the dialog box, and you'll be sent a recording of today's events tomorrow. But thank you once again to Martin, to Pat, and also in anticipation, thank you to your colleague Sue Millington, who is going to join you on the Q&A panel. To conclude this part of the meeting, I want to introduce Rob Morris of Siemens, who is one of the 2 Sector Deal champions. And Rob's going to round up on the whole industry challenges and opportunities ahead that come from what Pat and Martin have been describing. Over to you, Rob.
Well, first of all, good afternoon, and can you hear me? Hopefully that's a yes.
Yes.
Good. So thank you, David, Pat and Martin as well, and that's a marvellous introduction. So just to sort of reiterate, actually, I'm one of 2 industry champions for the Sector Deal digital pillar. Sean Jones of Thales is my counterpart. So I'm doing the honours today. There's no slides from me. It's a call to action, rah-rah, if you like, around the Sector Deal. And I guess just very broadly, what does the Sector Deal cover? Over its 5-year gestation period up to 2025, as we develop things further, it covers, of course, the digital transformation, and we've already heard quite a lot about that already. It covers data, and how do we use data and improve use of data for improved mobility and passenger experience. How do we bring sustainability into the rail industry more broadly? And that includes things like procurement, the boom bust cycle, and all those sorts of things. And how do we make sure from a UK perspective, we have got an exportable and inward investment type opportunity? How do we make the most of it? And of course, there's supporting foundations to that around skills, use of SMEs, all of that sort of thing, really harnessing the power of the UK. So I think it's worthwhile perhaps stepping back a little bit just to understand what was the sort of opening to the Sector Deal. And David had a picture of it on one of his first slides. In its preface, it said, it sets out a new approach to the rail industry and the government in partnership to transform the rail sector by taking clear action to increase the use of technology, boost productivity, improve the service received by those who use our railways, and build the skills of the UK workforce to capitalise on these options. What's very clear is the delivery of this deal will equip the railway for its strategic role as a driver of economic growth and provide a positive experience to passenger and freight users throughout the century to come, and actually into the next century too. And I guess never has the need for economic growth been so needed as now. From what we've experienced over the course of the last 3 months or so. And I guess this is reinforced by what the Prime Minister said in the last 48 hours with his build programme. And of course, I'm sure that will be further supplemented by announcements that we'll hear over the course of the next few days, weeks and months. Of course, we had the East Coast Main Line announcement beginning of last week, and of course the National Infrastructure Strategy, which will follow up in the months to come. So what is very clear is there's no option other than to make an absolute success of the sector deal. You know, the economy will benefit from it, the taxpayer will, the travelling public will, with more efficient services. All the operators will, whether that's Network Rail, the TOCs or BOX, or whatever form we're in, as the Williams review eventually plays out. And our supply chains will benefit. Our communities will benefit, and ultimately our nation will benefit. So what we've heard thus far from Martin and Pat is that we've already sort of started on the journey of the sector deal and T190, bringing them together by unlocking motivation, transforming through industry collaboration, which has already got off to a good start. And so digital transformation has already started. The long-term deployment plan is now formulated. Martin's just said that will be an ever improving, changing, nuanced plan, but it's definitely there. But what is also clear is, as each day goes on, we're swiftly approaching that mountain of renewals. And actually, there's no turning back. There is no other options, really. We have candidate schemes lined up to move us from base camp, if you like. We have an harmonised plan that brings the target 190 plus and the transfer remits together of a sector deal. The capability roadmap now is in formulation to test and guide us to match fitness. And it's now about making the most of the next weeks, months and years together as we progress through the transition and transformation phase that Martin so eloquently articulated then a few moments ago. Then we'll start getting up that hill with the first of the three of the priority schemes that are identified in that long-term development plan. So I guess in summary, you know, from a government perspective, from an industry perspective, well, actually from a national perspective, we've got very clear objectives, very common objectives here, of which everyone can benefit from. You know, industry engagement and support. It's already started off well. We now need to build on that. It's absolute paramount to make this a success. And it's clear that working together and lifting up some of the boundaries we've had before is going to make our future. And there'll be something there for everyone, the volumes that are too big. So really, from my perspective and from all those involved with the sector deal and across the industry, now this is a real call to action to start moving forward, and wherever we can, start bringing in wider supply chain involvement too. So from my perspective, that's a broad summary of where we are on the rail sector deal. If I can hand back to you, David, please.
Thank you very much, Rob. Thank you for a great summary and call to action. You're going to join us for the Q&A session afterwards. So if people have got questions for you, please can you all remember that to keep questions coming, use the dialogue in the question dialogue box. And after our next presenters, then we'll be going to the panel. So thank you very much, Rob. This being an Unlocking Innovation event, we now turn to the question of innovation. We've got two what we call elevator pitches, one from an organisation supporting innovation coming up momentarily, and another from an innovative SME. First up is Rob Hopkins. Can you bring your camera up, Rob?
Yeah, there we go.
We're calling you Robert today, aren't we, to avoid confusion with the Rob.
Okay.
So that's your Sunday name. Good afternoon, Robert.
Yeah.
So you're going. I'm going to hand over to you to tell us about how BCRRE, and you're going to explain what that is. BCRRE are going to help us ramp up the skills that we need in the industry to address this challenge that the others have been describing. Over to you, Robert.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Then I'll look for a little box on the left-hand side that tells me no one can, but so far so good. And yes, Rob Hopkins here from University of Birmingham. Called Robert today, my mother's name for me, so I always get a little bit anxious when I get called Robert. So here we are. The BCRRE is the Birmingham Centre for Rail Research and Education, and we're the largest single entity for rail research and education in the UK and across Europe. And so hopefully, I'm just trying to move the slide on. Okay, there we go. Right arrow does work. So today, I'm more highlighting the fact of our education provision. We're well known for our research. We're also well known across the world for our education, and most railway systems, sorry about that, most railway systems have benefited from one or more of our courses. So just before we talk about our most exciting course, which is directly relevant to digital railway or the digitization program, it's just a reminder really that we offer CPD. So any of the modules, you don't have to take a whole degree with us. So any of the modules that are part of our postgraduate talk provision can be studied as standalone modules. And that suits quite a few people. They're not interested in getting a full master's. They're not interested in getting a partial qualification like a postgrad certificate or whatever. They just want to find out a bit more about, for instance, electrification and traction systems. You can come along to that 1 week, and even virtually now, that will be easier. What would you like to? Oh, Siri's not kicking off. Don't you just love this? So what are we trying to do? What we're trying to do is we're trying to, as I say, develop courses that are more relevant to more people, especially as we move into more challenging circumstances. So I'm asking you to sort of look at that fourth one down, which is the Digital Railway Leadership course. And the three main modules. So what's the introduction to what digital railway systems is and are, the technologies that are involved that are part of the backbone or part of the adjoining technologies, and then implementing a digital railway system. So these are three modules, and we've been in touch with some of the higher echelons of the railway to inform that debate. And then the idea is that you would have a week at Birmingham, ideally, maybe by Zoom, maybe a bit of face-to-face and Zoom. Who knows? We're ready for anything and everything at the moment. The idea is that then we would then, assuming one is able to, we would then go to an international location and find out a bit more about how they do what that particular module is all about. So it'd be ideally a 1 week face-to-face, followed by another week, a few weeks later, seeing all that in context, immersing oneself in another country's example of good or / best practice. So again, it would also take, and these are all as equal as each other. So we're looking through the list of likely suspects. We're still developing this to an extent, but modules 1 and 2 are ready to go. So digital systems, innovation, we've heard all that today. It isn't an option, it is the way forward. But we also will be looking at business needs and also, of course, safety and security. So that's this qualification that we think is most relevant and you know, pertinent to the transformational change that we have to do. We have to achieve over the next few years, and then on and on and on. So this is ready to go. As I say, we'll be looking at the first module, the introduction module, being run in the spring of next year, and then in the autumn of next year, in semester 2, we'd go for module 2, the technologies one, and then the implementing one would be again 18 months later. So it's an 18-month program, 3 weeks residential, ideally, who knows, and then 3 immersion visits to international examples of good practice. And that's just to let you know that our research informs our teaching, so we're looking at, you know, all sorts of aspects of traffic management and what have you. So there you go, and I've been 1 minute longer, so I apologize for that. So thank you for listening. Everybody, please keep safe and carry on. And there's my contact details there if you want to get in touch. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, and to Siri. Thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you. So we move on now to our last pitcher, who is Simon Rodgers, who's representing Oodle today, who are working on self-contained Internet of Things sensing for railway applications. So Simon, do you want to give us your pitch? We can't hear you, Simon. You might need to unmute. You try again.
Can you hear me with these?
We can hear you with those. Yep. Go ahead.
Wonderful. It's going to look a strange arrangement. I do apologise.
Yeah.
So,
carry on.
Bit of history. G23 is an RSSB co-funded piece of work to research the use of cutting-edge standalone IoT devices on trains. These are their own battery, their own cellular comms, and they're completely independent of the train. They use narrowband IoT and LTE-M connectivity, which is part of the 5G spec, dedicated to machine-to-machine comms. And thankfully, it's well away from consumer tech, so it shouldn't, in theory at least, be saturated by 5G consumers. The project tests have been kept deliberately simple, as the devices and the comms are quite cutting edge. The thought process is that everything has a temperature, so let's measure that. Let's look for discrepancies, hot trains in the summer, for instance, as we saw failures during the very hot weather last year, or cold trains in the winter. And to set up alerts to prod operational staff, but really to use the data techniques to begin to forecast operational issues. After all, a training service is a train paying its way. Oodle is a spin out from the RSSB work with a clear remit to help cities and transport companies to discover and then communicate the things that they didn't know, like trains that are too hot in the summer, or most recently, telling customers when things were last cleaned, like handrails. Oodle uses IoT to make digital sense of the world, to create a digital twin, a digital representation of the train or the high street or whatever. It uses machine learning to make use of the data, and this would look to forecast things like last time it was 30 degrees and it was humid and the aircon hadn't been serviced for 90 days, let's say, it failed. Coaches X, Y, and Z fit this description. It's going to be hot next week, so maybe a chance to get them into to have a service. Oodle's mission is to use IoT data to help operations staff have a better view of their kit, keeping it doing what it should be doing, and providing the service it should be providing. So since starting the work, we've got quite a bit of interest, and we're already beginning to work with industry to look at rough ride from a few different angles. Firstly, from a semi-permanent system running on the trains to alert of excessive movement most or all of the time, or as a one-shot system, which you might want to fix for a week, let's say, after a report of a rough ride, and really in combination to create the digital twin of the train track interaction. A data layer that can, with time, understand where the issue is likely to be, the train, the track, or something completely different like the weather. Later in the month, we launch our air quality range of individual gas sensors that are designed to be inexpensive volume indicators of gas change. These are consciously aimed at the UK's challenge with post-COVID-19 recovery and sustaining the eco gains really that are made by less cars being on the road currently, certainly over the last few weeks. And also in response to COVID pandemic, but also another facet of the device, we're using IoT and data capability to provide smart asset tags. So imagine walking by a handrail and it telling you the last time it was wiped down automatically to your smartphone. Or rather than trying to find a particular piece of equipment, it knows exactly where it is. It has all of the asset information preloaded and can broadcast that information to anyone that's got the right credentials. And so as this is an elevator pitch, and with RIA's help, we're looking for industry partners and organisations that will need to communicate with staff and customers during the COVID-19 pandemic, or at least the recovery. Those wanting to create the digital twin and to gather information that's been traditionally tricky to gather. We're looking for partners. There we go. We're looking for partners and organisations that are excited as we are about finding out what they didn't know. And as a priority, we think Oodle can put the IoT into the recent Network Rail fibre sensing IoT and CCTV design contest. So we're also looking for partners on this. If you have any questions, like to get in touch, please use any of the following, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Simon. Thanks, and thank you to all the speakers for commendably keeping on time. Don't take your headphone off yet, because I'm going to ask all the other speakers to bring their cameras back up so that we can run a bit of a Q&A session here. And while we're waiting for colleagues to join, I'll ask you the first question, Simon, if I may. As an innovative SME looking to get into the industry, what are your top tips for other potential innovators, but also what are your top tips for those of us who might be able to sort of help you with barriers to entry? You know, what have been the good things and the bad things about your experience so far? You might need to put those headphones back on again. We can't hear you yet, Simon.
Can you hear me now?
We can, yes.
Wonderful. So I think to take the first point, top tip to those wishing to enter the industry is don't lose patience. Things can move a little slowly, but actually, you know, this is a fantastic industry to work in, and people really want to help, and I think organisations genuinely want to innovate, David. So, you know, really don't lose patience. What was the second part of the question?
So the second part of the question is, what would you ask of those of us in industry who try and influence decision makers to remove the barriers to innovation? You know, what's the barrier to innovation you can see? You've mentioned slowness.
I don't see. I think the industry is actually very keen to innovate. I think sometimes it's just a little difficult to get to the right people, and that's because it's a big and a complex industry, and it isn't necessarily resident in the UK. I don't think there's necessarily a problem with innovation per se. I think these events are absolutely perfect to bring us all together. So we have Rob at Siemens, and we have little Oodle, and we're both on the same call. I don't feel there's a problem, I think, is what I'm saying.
Okay, that's really refreshing. Thank you. Rob, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, all it was just to add something there to Simon. I think as a sort of a tier one provider, one of the things that has been an obstacle to us being innovative, if you like, is specification. And where we begin with digital transformation and what has happened on East Coast Mainline, for example, contracts, specifications are now becoming more outcome based as opposed to very sort of transactional. And that really opens up the floodgates for multiple tiers of innovation, agility, different ways of thinking, really exploiting the creativity you get in the engineering community. And if I look at you know, our business in Siemens, typically 50%, around 50% of what we do, and we do everything here in the UK, is done via the supply chain. And even though we're a large conglomerate, our agility is actually largely down to the tier twos and tier threes. And that symbiotic relationship is what we want to encourage even further as we go through digital transformation.
Thanks, Rob. Can I ask Sue to introduce herself, because you haven't spoken so far? Sue, we've asked you to join the panel. Do you just want to explain your role in all of this?
Hi, yes, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Susan Millington, and I work for Network Rail as a Senior Programme Manager. But for this process, I'm looking after the coordination of the rail sector deal, and with all the industry and government. But we're also working closely with T190 to develop the programme and the work streams from the transverse remits that Martin covered earlier today.
Thanks, Sue. We've got some great questions, and what I've tried to do is brigade them into some themes. So I'm questions to the panel. I might pick on an individual start off the answering the question, but if others have got wisdom to add to that, it'd be really welcome. But the first question is about the whole challenge of us getting, we've called it match fit, getting ready for CP7, ramping up to CP7. And the proposition that Pat described in long-term deployment plan is moving from 1,000 SEUs today to, in the future, up to 3,000. So what do we need to do differently to be match fit? And can we include in that also the broader change program? And Pat, you mentioned what the change program that the rest of the industry will have to go. Do you be ready for the talks, etc.? So would you like to pick that up first of all, Pat?
Yeah, quite happy to. One thing I'd like to point out first off is that we're not talking about trebling the size of the industry here. The budget available remains the same, £830 million per year. So the question isn't how do we suddenly become 3 times more able than we are at the moment. It's how do we deliver three times the volume with the resources we have, or at least the resource level we have. So that's where Target 190 and the sector deal come in, because they've got to together innovate to get to the position where we can deliver that volume within the constraints that we already work in. And so what we've identified is with a cab-based signalling system that doesn't have so much infrastructure on the track side, the access constraint goes away, but the volume is still constrained by what's affordable. So it's all about driving that cost down and driving the industry capability up. But as we said, the suppliers, and I completely agree with them, have pointed out that they can't do that in one giant leap. It's got to be a progressive growth, which is why you saw in the volumes profile, CP7 doesn't leap straight to 3,000 SEUs. There's the remaining part of CP6 and most of CP7 to get there. But that does require a throughput of, don't quote me on this because we don't know the exact industry size, but let's just say for a moment, something of the order of 3 tier 1 suppliers, each doing 3 projects to give us anything like the market capability we need. That's the journey we're on. That's the challenge we face. It looks daunting, and being daunted by it will not help us. We have to just press it.
So the number of active suppliers might expand, but the punchline, as you say, is it's delivering larger volumes with the same funding. So would you like to add anything to that in terms of the things that you're planning to get us ramped up and match fit for CP7?
Sure. So in terms of readiness, we have we've worked industry wide to produce a strategy within the rail sector deal, and that gives us a vision which we can all follow. And then following on from that, it's how do we deliver that on that vision. So working very closely with T190, who have got a raft of projects that cover the research and development. The rail sector deal have put a number of work streams together in order to deliver the short-term benefits in terms of things like the synthetic environment for the whole life cycle of a project. We're also looking at a different way to work with the industry. So rather than the transactional relationship we have at the moment in terms of our contracts, our national frameworks, we're looking to have a much longer relationship, which goes hand in hand, and moving away from the traditional transactional relationships that we usually have with our projects. So we're looking at how we can work with industry to better leverage the expertise from the supply chains, and we'll do that through a different procurement strategy.
So to give a sense of pace, Sue, by when will you need to be sort of going out and sort of sourcing suppliers and getting into a procurement phase?
So we've started the process in that regard. So we've instigated a market study to review the capabilities and the capacity of the market, the current market, on a global scale, and therefore we can take this data, analyse it, and see who we can utilise now, whilst keeping the door open for new incomers in the future. But it's to ensure ourselves that we have a capacity at the moment to ramp up those volumes as we've discussed, and then it's looking at the principles we wish to follow, and then setting up a completely new framework. So we're working on that now, and I suspect that will take a year, 18 months to deliver.
So okay, so within 18 months or so, we should see the sort of thing that the supply chain likes to see, which is an opportunity to bid for things. That would be fantastic. Rob Morris, if I could turn to you and perhaps also Martin now, there's a cracking question here which gets to the heart of one of the challenges we face, which is, what are we doing to make sure that the rest of the industry is as aligned as this group on the rollout of ETCS and the sector deal and so forth? And making the point that at the moment, there's there's a lot of negativity, quite vocal negativity around the industry in certain quarters. So your thoughts about whether that how we get the message out that this is plausible, deliverable, and coming to a railway near you soon.
I guess, shall I answer first, Martin?
Yeah.
I guess from a supplier's perspective, obviously we believe in it. We've already seen ETCS schemes already in place, Alstom with Crossrail, ourselves with Thameslink. We've now got East Coast Main Line. There's obviously the Cambria line as well with Hitachi or Ansaldo put in. So they were just the start. So we can see that there was it's the only way forward is for the reasons we've already heard. That's the only way forward we can go. I think what's really good about the sector deal is that two large industry players, Thales and Siemens, both believe in it. We're working hand in glove together to help champion this. We've had support from other players as well. That support is increasing, and it's very clear that there is no other way forward, and there is the real future. And it's not just a case of, if you like, competition here in the UK. It's a competition globally. All the companies I've just mentioned there, we are all playing globally and moving towards ETCS. It's inevitable. And the reality of it is we can't do that on our own. We need the broader community, both in at tier 1 level, but also at multiple levels. And hats off to Network Rail once again. Not only have been great over the last 3 months in terms of the COVID crisis, but also the long-term view of looking at what is the capability that we have in the UK at the moment, and there's a series of surveys going on that now to really determine what's the steady state now, what the aspirations of the industry are, and what the gap is. And that will help us collectively to understand how we can garner more support and where fresh input needs to be put in. Sorry, hopefully, Martin, I might have taken some of your stuff there, but that's how I see it as a supplier.
Martin, what would you like to add to that? Have you frozen, Martin? I'm not sure if you might have lost connection for a second. Okay, we'll come back to Martin when he's reconnected.
Shall I take it for Martin?
Actually, can you hear me now, David?
We can, yes, Martin. Yes, thank you. We can hear you, but can't see you so much.
Okay. Well, look, I think it all comes down to credibility fundamentally. What we're trying to achieve here, people are understandably going to be really skeptical about our ability to achieve what we're aiming for. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, we can still hear you, thanks. Yeah,
that's fine. We need to, I think, with some of our early projects that we're working with Sector Deal on, once we actually demonstrate that this can be done, so if we think of the synthetic environment, that will start to help our credibility and to restore people's faith, if you like, in the industry being able to deliver. So I think it's really important we get these things right. And it's a bit like Tufik talking about East Coast deployment yesterday. We've got to show we can do it, and then people will believe us. But at the moment, you can understand why people would be skeptical around our ability to deliver. But we genuinely believe we can deliver, and we do have a real burning platform for the industry that says we have to deliver. We have no choice in this.
Thank you. So there's 3 questions we give that I can see in the list that are examples of that understandable healthy skepticism, comparing the way we do things today to the way we might need to do them in the future. There's a question, for example, from Philip Sharrett saying, how are we going to manage the transition from conventional to ETCS? There's one from Ian Maxwell of the ORR. Can you really deliver enhancements in 6 months? That would be great, but can you do it? There's another one about the GRIP 1 to 4 tool set, saying that's all very well having a piece of software, but a lot of GRIP 1 to 4 is about stakeholder engagement. So there's a lot of angst there about the challenge of doing things differently. Could you pick up some examples there of how we'll change the way we do things while still looking after stakeholders and while still managing transitions?
Shall I take that? Yeah, there are several questions in there, so you probably have to remind me as we go. But in terms of the industry skepticism, etc., you can understand we're actually, what the long-term plan is telling us is we're standing on a burning platform. And you can't expect people to feel comfortable about that because their platform's on fire. So the only attraction you can offer for the other platform is it's not on fire. It might be really, really barren and difficult to get to, but that's the only option we have available to us. But having said that, we've got to make the transition across safely and securely. So that's why the plan is about match fit, R&D, develop, then deliver. Now, the East Coast Main Line project is being delivered very much in a conventional signalling style and environment, but delivering ETCS, and it's going to be a great learning platform for us. But I really don't think that's how we will be doing things by the time we're deep into CP7. We're used to simulating, and someone mentioned in that question there about GRIP 1 to 4. Well, no, GRIP 5 and 6, or GRIP 5 at least as well, so that we have in a simulated environment, in a lab environment, a totally validated design. It's not one we think is going to work, it's one we know is going to work, to the extent that we've been able to get authority to place into service on that design. And then we take it to site and build it. And that is a fundamental change in how we do things today. It shifts a whole load of behaviours and accountabilities. So, for example, today we have a TIC who is responsible for signing off that what's been built is safe and accountable. We instead will have a process for that. So the design might not be validated in the same way as the construction and quality is validated. Those sorts of things are difficult journeys, and that's why we're not saying we can do this and hit the ground running at the start of CP7 or even be doing this in CP6. We have to go through that learning curve, and that's why East Coast Main Line is so important to us. And I can't reiterate enough what Tufik said yesterday is, if we don't do this well, we're going nowhere. If we don't use it as our test bed and learning for those volumes and that new way of working, we still won't be going anywhere.
So to pick up the burning platform metaphor, we're in a situation where, from what you've all said here today, we've got a sustainability of the asset problem. We've got a backlog of renewals. We can't afford to do it. We can't afford to remedy that with conventional signalling. We need to move forward to digital because that offers us the chance of being able to do the volume at the right cost. But on the cost,
sorry, David, sorry to interrupt. I was careful not to say that it was ETCS level 2 or even that it's ETCS. At the moment, a long-term plan is predicated upon an incompatible new signalling system, whatever that might be. And it might be that we start the journey in long-term deployment plan in ETCS level 2 and either migrate to level 3 hybrid or level 3 or something else. And it might be that ETCS isn't always the right answer, but 190k per SEU or its equivalent has to be the right answer. So as we get to things like small branch lines and places where you might find tokenless block and so on, is ETCS going to be the right answer there? We don't really know. By the time we get there, maybe it will be, because it is so mature and it is relatively cheap. But that is the easy, sensible thing to do. But it might also be that we need some supplementary innovative signaling systems to plug on to ETCS. The plan is predicated upon change, not upon a given solution.
That's really helpful, Pat. You've just answered a question I haven't yet asked you. So thanks. Thank you for that. That's well anticipated. Turning now to Robert Hopkins. Robert, you've answered a question I was going to answer you as well, very comprehensively in your in the dialogue. So thank you very much for that. Having heard the level of change that's going that we need to, any further thoughts about how we get our people ready and adapt for the future and the level of change to our skill base?
Yeah, I'm probably not the best qualified to contact to respond. You know, that would probably be NSAR or something. But and because our offer is limited at level 7, which is postgraduate, but please that shouldn't put people off. You know, it's we're not always insisting on the first-class honours degrees to go on to our postgraduate. The School of Hard Knocks approach is so valuable in so many ways. So I feel quite happy to comment at that level. But the trainer inside me also suggests that we need to, and this is where we need to work together. Maybe the likes of RIA, the likes of the Rail Freight Group, the likes of Rail Alliance. And it was interesting to see, that Susan's looking at working with RIA in terms of getting together, suppliers that are ready to contribute. Well, there's all manner of suppliers, and I think given the fact that where the default setting is innovative or innovation, and the stakes are so high, then I think we need to all work, across that virtual sort of landscape, of tiers, tier 2 and below. This is all delightful news for me, the fact that we're all considering working together and getting the best out of not just the people, but the supply chain. And we're looking at producing some webinars which are aimed at the SMEs and the micro SMEs in the railway sector. And there's no reason why we don't make those available to other trade associations or groups or bodies. We'd be delighted to do that.
That would be very welcome. Thank you. So there's a question here that's probably a.
Just like to add, Dave.
Yeah, go on, Sue.
No, I'd just like to add that to what Simon mentioned earlier and Robert's just said. This is a brilliant opportunity for us all to work together, and it's quite a unique time, because this is the biggest change we've been looking at in the rail industry for many decades, and it is significant. And as Rob said earlier, we can't do this alone, and we recognise that. So that's a level of maturity which is good to see. But by working together and working closely, we can be thinking about the changes of standards of products, training that we need as we go. And because of this maturing relationship, we can bring people along, and rather than just at the end of a development or a product enrichment, that we hand it over. We're all going along this journey together, so hopefully there won't be a big bang at the end of it. We'll be learning and maturing together.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, really good. So I'm going to turn to there's a number of moderately technical questions, which I think I'm going to ask the panelists to if they can answer offline. But there's a couple I'd like to ask, and this might be a Martin question, but others chip in as appropriate. So how does all of this align with other initiatives that we see going on in the industry, leading technology initiatives like traffic management, like EU links? How do they contribute towards this?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So, so for traffic management, for example, newly formed regions are defining where and how that happens for each of their regions, but they are also the owners of their own part of the long-term deployment plan. So in essence, they're planning both aspects hand in hand, so that should join that piece up. In terms of EU links, it's been wrapped up within our T190 Plus programme, and it's a feed into our longer term aspiration for a common system architecture in the longer term, okay, which is something we're working on with European colleagues, which is the reference CCS architecture piece. So EU links is a feed into that. It's the first step towards that, I guess.
Okay, thanks, Martin. So, to my understanding, just to sort of I'm going to summarise the stepping stones, just to sort of give the audience a view of to where we're moving. So, we've got a strategy and a plan in place. We've got T190 in place, funding R&D. We've got the suppliers have been interviewed to establish their readiness for new approaches to simulation and developing things in a BIM environment. We're moving into a feasibility study for that GRIP 1 to 4 tool set, and you'll hear about that tomorrow. And then we're moving towards the GRIP 5 to 7 tool set. So we're putting in place the tools, and that's all part of the joined up plan that moves us towards CP7 and bringing on board the suppliers that will be able to work collaboratively with Network Rail to deliver what we're aiming for. So that's me trying to sort of summarize a lot of what colleagues have said. If I just could ask you in the last couple of minutes, if I can just pick on each of you and just say, you know, what is the one thing that you think we should really take away from today as to the thing we need to do differently or better going forward? So if I can pick on Rob Morris first, if you don't mind, Rob.
Talk.
Good one.
Yes, that's what one. You know, this session for me has been great, just on a sort of a small amount of questions relatively, but we're actually talking about some of the issues, some of the uncertainties, and all of that. And if you like, over a course of the last few months, we've been talking in a smaller community that's gently growing, but we at the right point, we really need to grow that community, really talk and answer some of the many questions that will no doubt follow this session.
Excellent, thanks. Martin, what's your one thing?
Well, it's probably a little bit more than one, but I think it's recognising the imperative to change. It's incumbent on all of us to not retreat into our shells when we hit a challenge, because being no doubt this is going to be really difficult. Things aren't going to go smoothly all the time, and what we cannot afford to do as an industry is to retreat into our own silos when that happens. Actually, we've got to do the opposite. We've got to work more closely together to get this over the line, because all our futures and the success of fundamentally the industry does rely on us getting this right. So that's my key takeaway.
Spot on.
Okay, thanks. Sue, yours.
Don't fear failure. So we'll be developing a new synthetic environment that we'll be taking forward for decades. And by fearing the failure that will ensue when you're doing any big innovation, is that you don't push the boundaries. And I think collectively we've got a unique opportunity to bring all this experience, all this knowledge together and do something really great. So don't close off ideas, in fear of change or failure to block the innovation. Let's consider all ideas.
And if we're going to fail fast and learn. Pat, quick one for
Learn
you.
fast and take it,
Yeah,
learn from. Absolutely.
don't become too engineering led. Andy Stringer told us yesterday, remember, if the passenger doesn't notice, it's probably not worth doing. So somewhere along the line, this renewals challenge needs to turn into positive benefits for the passenger, whether that be reduced ticket costs and by extension from the passenger, also taxpayer, whether that means that we can deliver a better, more affordable railway. And that's all about operations, people, process, as well as technology. Us engineers are a bit prone to liking bright, shiny things and presenting them as a solution to a problem that they didn't know they had.
Yeah, we've got to remember we're here to run a railway for the benefit of passengers and freight. Rob Hopkins, last quick thought.
Yeah, thank you. Sort of building on what others have said, really, as a disciple of ISO 44001, I would say openness. And openness comes before trust, comes before, innovation, comes before delivery. So I would say, and it builds on what Susan was saying, what Pat was saying just immediately, is be open to new ideas, new thinking, new partners, etc. So openness.
Excellent, thank you. Simon, the innovator, chance for a pithy last thought.
Can you hear me okay for starters?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. I'm going to compliment Rob. His talk to my listen. So it's really refreshing to hear Rob in this gigantic organisation talking to another gigantic organisation and working together to do something really positive and exciting. And it's also exciting to hear Pat not trying to predict the future in CP6, 7, 8, 9, 10. He's looking at cost, he's looking at the technology, he's looking at innovation. And I think if we all work together and don't try to predict too far into the future, and we do talk, we do hopefully listen to us tiny little innovators, then there might be some little gems in there.
They just might. Really good point, and a really positive way to bring it to a close. Thank you for that, Simon. I hope today's been useful to everybody attending in bringing you all up to speed on the ambitious plans for the near future to deal with this challenge of transitioning to a new technology while we're delivering increased volumes at an efficient cost and still running a railway. It just remains to say thank you once again to our speakers, to Martin Jones, to Pat McFadden, to Sue Millington, Rob Morris, Simon Rodgers and Robert Hopkins. Thank you very much. Also to my colleagues at RIA who are working behind the scenes to make all of this work so seamlessly. Thank you all, and we'll see you again tomorrow at 2 p.m. Where the subject is innovation for digital railway. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time this afternoon, everybody, and thanks again to the speakers.
Thank you.